The war drums are beating in Russia, with leaders from the Kremlin to London and Berlin saying we could be on the verge of a conflict.
Но если Европа вдруг захочет с нами воевать и начнет, мы готовы прямо сейчас.
But given the heavy losses it's taken in Ukraine, is that really anything more than talk? Russia wants to maintain the image of itself as a great power ready for anything. And Western countries, with their squeezed public finances, need to make the case to boost their defence spending. But there's a reason for that. Things are changing, with big increases in Russian arms production and spending. So it's worth asking, what kind of threat does Russia pose to Europe? As always with estimates of this kind, that's a question of capability and intent. While the Russian military has taken a great deal of damage in Ukraine, much of its arsenal, including its strategic weapons, has not. They still maintain the world's biggest nuclear stockpile, around 5,000 warheads, mounted on 324 ballistic missiles, 71 bombers, and 12 missile-launching submarines. Those vessels are part of a force of more than 50 subs that are of particular concern to the UK. In recent months, there have been reports of Russian subs close to the Scottish coast and of their survey vessel Yantar mapping our undersea defences.
That Russian action is deeply dangerous, and this is the second time this year that this ship, the Yantar, has deployed to UK waters. So my message to Russia and to Putin is this: we see you, we know what you're doing, and if the Yantar travels south this week, we are ready.
Russia's Air Force has more or less managed to maintain its strength, having produced around 40 new fighter jets to replace the ones lost over Ukraine. And more importantly, they've also upped the production of missiles to mount on those aircraft. And new low-cost weapons, such as the Shahed attack drone, are being produced in huge numbers, more than 200 a day in fact. And they're using those liberally against Ukraine. If there was a ceasefire with that country and production of those drones continued at the same rate, they would soon have stockpiled thousands for possible use against NATO countries. And the same applies to many other types of munitions. Russia's arms industry is running hot, and they're making weapons at 4 times the rate of all NATO countries combined, including the US. So Russia does have considerable capabilities, but the Ukraine campaign has imposed enormous costs. Western countries tend to put very high estimates on the numbers of Russians killed, around 250,000 for example. Russian journalists tracking the actual names of the deceased reckon it's at least 150,000, maybe as much as 200,000. And critically among those are around 7,300 officers, the people actually commanding units at the front. That's a generation of future colonels and generals taken out.
Lieutenant General Fanil Savarov died when his vehicle exploded in the capital's Yasnaya district.
Russia's recent failure to exploit some limited advances in the Donbass is blamed by many analysts on the loss of that generation of skilled younger officers. And it will take a great deal of time for that know-how to be replaced. In addition to that human toll, some of the more sophisticated weapons, like tanks and fighter planes, are proving hard to replace also. That's in no small part due to Western sanctions. So the question is, how much time will it take Russia to restore its capabilities in those critical areas? The generals and spy masters want Europe to accelerate its rearmament. Furthermore, they warn that time is running out. An assessment carried out by NATO 2 years ago suggested that if the Ukraine war stopped, Russia would need until 2029 to rebuild its military. But the head of NATO has recently suggested that that timeline could be shortening.
We have a heavily reconstituting Russia at a pace which is really threatening. They cannot mount a successful attack against NATO territory now, but in 3 to 5 years they might be able.
And you can find shorter estimates, because the question of when will Russia be ready is a bit of an opinion sport. For example, the Norwegian defence chief has suggested that the Kremlin could rebuild its forces as soon as 2026 or 2027. Ultimately, it's a matter of educated guesswork. We don't know exactly how long it would take Russia to produce the munitions and reman their divisions to the point that they would feel confident that if they did get into a confrontation with a neighbouring NATO member, they would be able to overmatch the West. So that's capability. What about intent? Does Putin actually want a major confrontation with the West? In a place like the Kremlin, key decisions, like the choice of war and peace, ultimately rest with one man.
A third Russian man is facing charges over his alleged involvement in the Salisbury poisoning.
Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk has confirmed that Russian drones were shot down in Polish airspace overnight.
German authorities have begun an investigation to identify the drone's origin. It's the latest in a string of similar incidents across Europe.
2 Ukrainians working for Moscow have been identified as key suspects in 2 recent cases of railroad sabotage inside Poland.
Some argue that sending nerve agents, drones and saboteurs into Western countries shows that war has already begun.
Не буду больше. Не надо больше не буду. Не буду больше ни во Францию, ни в Данию, ни в Копенгаген. Куда еще-то летают? На это самое. Да везде долетают. Да, в Лиссабон.
And given Putin's nostalgia for the Soviet Union and use of force in its former republics like Georgia, Moldova or Ukraine, he clearly has no qualms about ordering the Russian armed forces into action. But going up against a NATO country would be very different. And going up against a former republic that's now joined NATO, like those 3 Baltic republics, could be very problematic. He would risk uniting NATO against him. Putin might bet on Trump's inaction, but that's a real risk when there's nuclear powers involved. Many NATO countries have shown themselves distinctly reluctant to offer troops for a stabilization force for any Ukraine peace deal. And in the Kremlin, that may well have generated a perception of Western weakness.
At the end of a conflict in Ukraine, however it concludes, we are going to have a very big Russia problem. We are going to have a situation where Russia is reconstituting its force, is located on the borders of NATO, is led by largely the same people as it is right now, is convinced that we're the adversary, and is very, very angry.
Putin has long been obsessed with asserting Russian dominance over the former Soviet republics. And taking on one of those that had joined NATO, like the 3 Baltic republics, might just be a gamble that he was willing to take.